Hello and welcome back, this is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Architect video. This time what we're going to be focusing on is disasters. We're going to be pretty much finished with the disasters. I'm not going to edit them, not going to add anything to them, just going to try and get them completely finished. But before I get into the disasters, I'm going to look at some of the other things that I've worked on. And the first thing I want to show is that we have a new explosion for deconstruction. So when I destroy this, you'll see that there's a new effect, new smoke, and it just adds a little bit more to the deconstruction. It's also working differently. Instead of it being on every object, now it's actually just getting spawned in on the location. Should have done that from the beginning. The next thing is that we have this options menu changed a little bit. We got the button animations that we've been putting on everything, but we've also got a few extra things. So you can save the game here. You can also delete the save, which was going to be on the main menu, but for now I've got it here. And we've also, I don't know if the saving is going to be an automatic thing or you're just going to be able to save manually. Probably save manually, but for now this is all working. You can click anything you want, you can restart. The next thing I want to show is that the Adventurer Guild now has all of the stats here on the right. They are all working, they're all working correctly. It's just that they're not saving when the level resets. I just had to do a save data for them, the same thing I've done before. You can see some of the stats are already changing, so shops visited, dungeons visited, how many deaths in total, we got 4 so far, expeditions completed 4, we got gold earned so far, we've got a ton of different stats both for the island and for the dungeon. While we're in the Adventure Guild, you'll also see that we have an island docks and island shelter right here. This is all working as well. You can open and close them. And this will stop adventurers either coming into the island or it'll force them to go into shelters where they'll be protected from disasters, so that you don't lose any money when they die. The next thing is that the lighting has been reduced for a lot of these individual prefabs, specifically as well the paths, because they're a little bit too bright and a little bit focused. Now they've been they're open a lot more and they're less focused, they're not as strong as they were. Okay, so the thing I'm going to talk about now is the disasters. So I'm going to go down the list. The first one is the monster raid, so when they escape, that's just activated here. I've disabled the randomize between the numbers, different states, just while I've been testing. So all I'll do is I'll put in the number of the specific state. And I'll do that for some of these as well, just to demonstrate. But basically, the monster one hasn't really changed, so I'm not going to show it. I've shown it a couple of times in the past. Essentially, a monster gets spawned at one of these disasters, and they have depending on the level of the disaster will determine what they do. So the first level is 1 monster, the second level disaster spawns 2 monsters, and the third level disaster spawns the 3rd monster, each one with more health. And the third one, the only difference is that it disables the dungeon for 30 seconds after the raid. So it takes some time to sort of rebuild it in a sense, resecure it. So that hasn't really had any visual changes. So what I'm going to move on to now is the ocean rise, or specifically the flooding disaster. So let's set that to 3. That should activate it, and then we can go in here and show it. So this one has had some visual changes and some mechanical changes. As I mentioned, now you'll have to open your shelters. You'll also see that we have some rain. This is an indicator of the flooding. So if you see some light rain or heavy rain or extreme rain, you'll know which level it is as well from that. So right now it's just level 1, so we've got this basic flooding, just stops people coming in. And now what's going to happen is that when the disaster hits level 2 on the flood, it's actually going to start destroying food, and it's actually going to cause lots of destruction to that food production. What's going to happen on the 3rd is, you've guessed it, the water destruction. So the water is something that generates much more slowly than food, and so it's much more valuable. And on the 3rd disaster, it's going to start destroying water, so getting a huge storage of it and getting a lot of water is going to be a huge priority, especially on the later levels. So right now we have the anti-production disaster active. So this is the next one. So at level 1, this anti-production is going to slow down production. Number 2 is actually going to almost halt production, not completely, but it's close to halting it, so it's much slower. And then with the final one is that we have a donated production to appease masses. So This is to make sure that the island stays happy. It'll actually remove resources and donate them off the island for free, and this will make sure that happiness still stays up. It'll do it forcibly on the 3rd disaster level, so make sure you have lots of materials. And what it's going to take is specifically any productions material. So if you have a black rock mine or an iron mine, it's going to specifically take those resources, so whatever production you have. And the more production you have, the more resources it will take. So if I have 5 iron mines, it's going to take 5 iron resource. The next one is the unpopular unrest disaster. However, I'm thinking I'm going to leave that mostly as it is because it's already quite devastating. It essentially what it does is it's just how it was before. Essentially, it's going to make the NPCs really unhappy. They're going to be really unhappy with how the environment is. They're just going to be unhappy in general. There's going to be this unrest. What's going to happen is that it's going to lower the happiness of all the NPCs. It's going to require more to keep their happiness up. This means that you're going to have high level stores. Essentially, this disaster becomes less and less of a threat the more stuff you have, the better rating you have, but ultimately it's very devastating because the happiness is just so much lower. Now, the next thing I want to mention is that the forest fire disaster is, I know I said I wouldn't work on this anymore, but the forest disaster is currently on hold because I'm making a new effect for the fire. So the fire has been removed temporarily. At the moment, I'm just making some new effects. I've been messing around with the special effects. I'm actually going to do a separate video, I think, on this as well, potentially, like just showing a bunch of effects I've made. Like the rain, for example, but we also have this magic orb that I've been working on for some of the attacks in the dungeon. I might show them when I'm showing off the dungeon, but essentially I'm playing around with the new visual effects, graphs and things like that, and so I want to keep that off the board for now. But yeah, the fire isn't done yet, so you won't see any visual effects of the fire. But essentially what happens is that during the disaster, what's going to happen is it's actually going to burn scenery, and then after a certain amount of time it will destroy it. Depending on the level of the scene of the forest fire, it will spread to other squares next to it if they're scenery. And essentially this is going to lower your rating. So this is going to damage your rating specifically. You could end up with an entire map without any scenery if you don't control it. To control it, all you have to do is just have enough water. Now we move on to the really big one, which is the earthquake. So the quake is something that I didn't show at all, so I'm going to go in a little bit more detail with this one. So essentially you just have 3 levels again, depending on the level. It spawns a specific icon and sets true one of these. So in the disaster, these are just true or false. What this means by setting these true determines what actually gets affected within the building stats. So if I go over to the building stats right here, you'll see that we have a new section which is to do with the quakes, and you'll see the effects right here. So what you can see here is that depending on the bool that gets activated, so if it's medium, small, large, one of those 3, you'll see that it affects the health of the building. So the buildings now have health. Essentially they do need to be repaired after this disaster. Of course you can leave it later and later, and the price is always the same, so you can leave it as late as possible before it gets destroyed and then repair it. It'll still take the same amount of resources, but of course it's more risk because depending on the level of the quake can determine how much damage it does. So every time I believe it's every 2 seconds, this will drop down by 2, 3 and 4. And again it's every 2 seconds, so, and it's 100 is the amount. So ultimately, you should keep an eye on this very, very closely with buildings, especially after the earthquake disaster. What you can see here is also what happens when it reaches 0, so it'll actually destroy the building, which means you'll lose any upgrades that are on it as well, and you'll lose a lot of stuff if a building is fully upgraded or if it's an expensive building. So this is going to be very important. but it's only on the buildings. It's not on scenery, it's not on paths or anything like that. It's just the buildings, so I believe shops, dungeons, housing. I believe they're the only ones. I could be missing one. Oh, and I believe the shelter as well. So the next thing is I want to show right here is we do have an effect right here, which is one of the custom effects that's been made. So we have these damage smoke, which is coming from the building, so I'll show that off in a minute, but if it's only got a quarter left, it's going to show up as smoke. This also isn't a guarantee that you will take damage for the building, so it's a bit randomized, so depending on the level will determine a percentage chance. So for this one it's 20%, this one it's 50%, and this one it's 80% chance of happening. So this gives a bit of variety to all the buildings, so there's no guarantee that the building will be affected during this disaster. So enough talking about it, let's actually show it. You'll see that the screen shakes. I've covered shaking in other games and other videos, so I'm not going to cover it again, but you see that we got a level 2 earthquake right here. Also, this icon is probably going to be moved to the side. If we click on one of these buildings, you'll see that our damage is going down, and depending, it's very random, so sometimes it'll move very little, sometimes a lot. So if we go to different buildings, you'll see that they have different amounts. You can see that it's quite a lot still, but essentially what you can do is you can repair. So we have a repair button right here next to the upgrade. If I click this, it'll actually repair it back to full. When it gets lower than 25%, it's going to immediately start smoking. So just as an example, I'm just going to repair a couple of these, and I'm going to wait until another disaster for these to start getting lower than 25%. So I'll cut to that. So you can actually see that some of our buildings are actually smoking. So this one right here, our shop is smoking, but none of the others are. This is again randomized. So this one's smoking, so it's actually pretty low, as you can see. You can actually see the percentage right there. It's a little bit small on the screen, but you can actually see a percentage. So it's actually it's at 50%, 15%, I mean. And you can see some of these buildings are now smoking a lot. You'll also see right here that the dungeon is smoking, and what will happen is these will actually get destroyed. But as you can see, these were destroyed. We've got this dungeon that's been destroyed. On the next disaster, we're probably going to lose one of them, so I'm just going to repair that one. And as you can see, the smoke is just gone. Now another thing to mention is that you will see the debris effect that appears on the island when the effect happens, when the shake happens. That's just added extra. So that's what we got so far. So if I just cover what we got left to do, it's the dungeons and their effects slash attacks. So very much the dungeon aspects of the stuff needs to be done. The fire needs to be done in terms of effects. So there's going to be a lot of effects works going on, but for the most part there's only going to be a couple more videos left. Then it's lastly I'm going to be covering new levels, which will take me a little bit of time, but I'll probably cover it in one video. So a bunch of new levels, some varied objectives. So instead of lots of objectives like we got, it's going to be maybe 2 or 3 objectives, maybe sometimes 1 objective, and for those specific levels. We're looking at only a couple more videos, maybe 3 or 4 videos left, and they'll be covering very, very specific things. This has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.